A millionaire adopts the janitor's niece as his own daughter, despite his own son's hatred. Little did he know that years later, his wife and son would cry when the girl... The car came to a slow stop in front of the Weasley estate, a towering, ivy-clad mansion looming against the grey afternoon sky. The wrought-iron gates had swung open soundlessly at their arrival, but to Sharon, they might as well have been a cage locking behind her. Ronald Weasley stepped out first, his tailored suit crisp despite the damp weather. Sharon followed hesitantly, her small figure nearly swallowed by the oversized coat someone had draped over her at the funeral. The wool smelled of unfamiliar cologne. Sharp, expensive. It wasn't hers. A gust of wind swept through the circular driveway, kicking up fallen leaves and rustling the towering trees lining the estate. Sharon's thin arms tightened around herself. The house was too large, too grand, too unfamiliar. Behind her, Deborah Weasley descended gracefully from the car, adjusting her gloves as she surveyed the scene. Her expression was unreadable, but the tightness in her jaw gave away her discomfort. "Come inside," Ronald said, not unkindly, but without the warmth of invitation. Sharon's legs moved on their own, trailing after him. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes, a small, lonely sound in the vast emptiness of the estate grounds. She had nothing left. They had returned from Josh's funeral only an hour ago. The scent of damp earth still clung to Sharon's senses, the sight of the coffin, the muted murmurs of sympathy, the hollow weight in her chest. Josh, her grandpa who had raised her, was gone. For 30 years, Josh had served the Weasleys. He had been the first to arrive every morning and the last to leave at night, never once complaining about the cold winters or the sweltering summers. He had been here since the early days when Ronald Weasley's father, the first owner of the mansion, hired him when they finished building the place. Josh had seen Samuel take his first steps and had carried him on his shoulders through the garden. And yet, in the end, he had died alone, in a small room at the servants' quarters, taken by fever before anyone even realized how sick he had become. Now Sharon was alone too. Ronald had made the decision at the cemetery. Not a grand speech, not a dramatic vow, just a simple statement, made with the kind of certainty that didn't allow room for discussion. "She stays with us." It hadn't been a question. The moment she stepped out, she felt the weight of eyes, servants peeking from behind curtains, their whispers barely concealed. The air smelled like rain, polished wood, and something faintly floral, as if the very walls of this house had been steeped in elegance for generations. Deborah Weasley stood by the entrance, poised in a navy dress that fit her like a second skin. Her face was unreadable, her sharp gaze flicking over Sharon before shifting toward Ronald. "I assume this is your decision then?" she asked, her voice cool but not unkind. "It is," Ronald replied simply. Sharon looked between them, unsure of her place in this exchange. Then, footsteps, quick, irritated. Samuel. The 14-year-old boy stood at the top of the marble staircase, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes burning with something close to contempt. He was tall for his age, his dark hair slightly tousled, his expression a carefully crafted mask of indifference. "You can't be serious," he said, directing his words at his father, but not bothering to lower his voice. "You brought her here?" Ronald's posture didn't shift. "She's staying with us." Samuel let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "So what? We're collecting orphans now." His gaze snapped to Sharon, sharp and scrutinizing. "Where's she supposed to sleep? In the servants' quarters?" A silence stretched between them. "She'll have a room," Ronald said, his tone edged with finality. Samuel scoffed but didn't argue. Instead, he turned on his heel and disappeared down the hall, his retreating footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. Sharon exhaled slowly, the tension wrapping around her chest loosening only slightly. Deborah let out a quiet sigh, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress. Then, with a nod to one of the maids, She said, "Show her to the guest room." A woman in a crisp uniform stepped forward and gestured for Sharon to follow. The hushed murmurs of the staff trailed behind them as they moved through the halls. The mansion was too big, too grand, too cold. Every step Sharon took felt misplaced, like she was trespassing in a life she had no right to enter. The walls were lined with paintings, and the chandeliers above glittered with a kind of silent opulence that made her chest feel tight. They stopped at a door at the far end of the hall. The maid pushed it open, revealing a modest room, small compared to the rest of the house, but still more luxurious than anything Sharon had ever known. A four-poster bed, thick drapes, a writing desk, and an intricately carved wardrobe. "Dinner is at 7, the maid said before exiting, the door clicking shut behind her. Sharon stood there for a long moment, her fingers grazing the edges of the blanket folded at the foot of the bed. Everything felt too clean, too untouched. She should be grateful. She should be relieved. Instead, she climbed onto the mattress, pulled her knees to her chest, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the mansion, the faint hum of conversation drifted through the halls. She was here. But she wasn't home. And she wasn't sure if she ever would be. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of the Weasley estate, casting long, golden streaks across the polished wooden floors. Outside, the sound of birdsong barely penetrated the thick glass windows, muffled like an echo from a world Sharon no longer belonged to. She stood in front of the large mirror in her guest room, her hands smoothing down the front of her dress, one of the few possessions she had from before. The faded fabric was neatly pressed, but there was no denying that it didn't belong in this house, not among the silks and satins the Weasleys were accustomed to. She had spent the night curled beneath the thick, unfamiliar blankets, sleep coming in restless fits. The grandeur of the room should have felt comforting, but the vastness only deepened her loneliness. Now, as she stepped out into the hallway, she moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb the air. Downstairs, the scent of fresh bread and coffee lingered in the air, a sharp contrast to the muted silence of the mansion. She hesitated at the entrance to the kitchen, watching as the maids moved with quiet efficiency, cracking eggs, pouring tea, setting fine china onto silver trays. Taking a deep breath, Sharon stepped forward. "Do you need any help?" she asked, her voice polite but uncertain. The women stilled for a moment, exchanging glances. The head maid, an older woman with streaks of silver in her hair, wiped her hands on her apron. "That's not necessary, Miss Sharon. Everything is taken care of." The formality in her tone stung. She had spent years helping Josh with chores, cooking, sweeping, scrubbing floors until her fingers ached. But here, her hands felt useless. A moment passed before she nodded and stepped away, feeling more out of place than ever. The dining room was already set when she entered. Ronald sat at the head of the table, the morning paper folded beside his plate. Deborah poured tea with practiced ease, her expression unreadable as Sharon took a seat. Then Samuel walked in, dressed impeccably in a pressed white shirt, his posture relaxed, yet exuding effortless arrogance. He barely glanced at Sharon before dropping into his chair. A smirk played at his lips as he reached for the butter knife. "So, is the stray planning on staying long?" Deborah's hand tightened around her teacup. Ronald exhaled through his nose but said nothing. Sharon stared at her plate, forcing herself to take a bite of toast. The food, though rich and flavorful, tasted like nothing in her mouth. Samuel leaned back, watching her with quiet amusement. "You know, charity cases usually say thank you when someone feeds them." Sharon swallowed, setting her fork down carefully. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but she knew it wouldn't matter. So she did what she always did. She endured. Deborah glanced between them before sighing. "Samuel, that's enough." Samuel shrugged but didn't argue. Instead, he picked up his coffee and took a slow sip, as if savoring the small victory. The rest of breakfast passed in strained silence. Later that afternoon, Sharon wandered outside. The garden stretched beyond the estate, neatly trimmed hedges surrounding a field of roses in full bloom. She moved through the rows, her fingers brushing over the petals, taking comfort in their softness. Josh had loved roses, always whispering to them as he trimmed the stems, saying they grew better when spoken to kindly. A shadow fell over her. She turned to see Ronald standing a few steps away, his hands in his pockets. He watched as she knelt beside a flower bed, carefully adjusting the soil around the roots of a wilting stem. "You like the garden?" he observed. Sharon nodded, wiping her hands against her skirt. Josh always said plants need patience, that if you take care of them, they take care of you. Ronald hummed in thought. His gaze lingered on her, but he didn't press further. "Dinner is at 7, was all he said, before turning and walking back toward the house. That night, as Sharon prepared for bed, she found her dress folded neatly on the chair by the vanity. But as she picked it up, her breath hitched. Dark ink stained the fabric in long, deliberate strokes, ruining the only thing she had left that felt like her own. She didn't need to guess who had done it. Her fingers trembled for only a moment before she straightened, taking a steady breath. Instead of crying, instead of running to tell someone, she simply carried the dress to the bathroom, filled the sink with water, and began scrubbing. The ink didn't come out. Still, she didn't stop. Hours later, Deborah passed by the door and paused. Through the small crack, she saw Sharon hunched over the sink, hands red from the scrubbing, her face calm but determined. For the first time since the girl arrived, something inside Deborah shifted. Pity, admiration, or perhaps something more. The days blurred into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life in the Weasley mansion settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm, one where Sharon existed on the fringes, never demanding, never imposing, only observing and adapting. She had learned that the Weasley estate functioned like a carefully orchestrated play, where every movement had its place and every silence held meaning. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers. The air carried a perpetual scent of polished wood and fresh lilies, and the voices that filled the halls were always measured, always restrained. Sharon moved through the mansion with practiced ease, folding linens in the laundry room before the maids could get to them, straightening books on the shelves when no one was looking, wiping down the edges of the grand piano, even though she had never heard anyone play it. It was her way of proving that she was useful, that she had a place here, even if no one explicitly told her so. Ronald noticed. It was in the way he caught glimpses of her adjusting the curtains in the sitting room, the way he saw her kneeling in the garden, tending to the roses without ever being asked. It reminded him of Josh, of quiet dedication, of a presence that didn't demand, but rather earned its space. One evening, as Ronald sat in his study, flipping through a stack of documents, he glanced up as Sharon passed by the open door. "Sharon," he called, his voice steady but firm. She paused, stepping hesitantly into the room. "Yes, sir." He gestured for her to come closer. "Sit." She obeyed, perching lightly on the edge of the chair across from him, hands folded neatly in her lap. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, setting the papers down. "How do you find life here?" Sharon hesitated. It was the first time he had asked her anything so directly. "It's different," she said carefully, unsure of what answer he expected. "But I'm grateful to be here." He nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. Then, after a beat, he leaned forward slightly. "You're a bright girl, Sharon, I can see that." A flicker of something unfamiliar rose in her chest, something dangerously close to hope. "I want to arrange a tutor for you," he continued, "someone who can ensure you receive a proper education." Sharon blinked. The offer was unexpected, almost surreal. Education had never been promised to her before. It had always been a privilege meant for others, something she had only watched from the outside. She opened her mouth to thank him, but before she could speak, the door burst open. Samuel stood in the doorway, his face twisted in disbelief. "You're giving her a tutor?" Ronald's expression remained unreadable. "Yes." Samuel let out a humorless laugh, stepping further into the room. "She's not one of us." Sharon lowered her gaze, willing herself to disappear into the fabric of the chair. "She lives in this house," Ronald said calmly. "That makes her one of us." Samuel scoffed, shaking his head. "She's a stray you picked up out of pity. You think giving her an education will make her your daughter?" His voice was sharp and biting, but underneath it lay something else, something Sharon couldn't quite name. "That's enough," Ronald said, his tone carrying the weight of finality. Samuel clenched his jaw, but didn't push further. Instead, he turned sharply on his heel and stalked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Silence settled between them once more. Ronald exhaled through his nose, pinching the bridge of it briefly before looking at Sharon again. "Ignore him." Sharon nodded, though the tightness in her chest made it difficult to breathe. "You'll begin your lessons next week." She swallowed hard. "Thank you." Ronald simply nodded and returned to his papers, dismissing her without another word. That night, as Sharon entered her room, she found something unexpected resting on her pillow: a book. It was old but well kept, the pages slightly worn, the spine softened by time. There was no note, no indication of who had left it, but she knew. She traced the edges of the cover with her fingertips, her heart pounding softly against her ribs. Deborah. The woman had never said much, never openly embraced her presence, but this was something. A quiet offering, a small but significant gesture. The warm aroma of roasted vegetables and simmering broth curled through the grand halls of the Weasley mansion, carrying the promise of dinner. Deborah stood at the entrance to the kitchen, her gaze sweeping over the gleaming countertops and the coordinated movements of the chefs as they plated the evening's meal. The head cook, a stout man with a serious expression, arranged a fillet of poached salmon onto an elegant porcelain dish. "Sharon doesn't eat fish," Deborah said abruptly. The cook hesitated, glancing at her uncertainly. "Madam." "She doesn't like it," Deborah repeated, her tone leaving no room for question. "Make something else." The kitchen staff exchanged glances before one of the sous chefs quickly began preparing a fresh plate of chicken. Deborah nodded once in approval before stepping away, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. She wasn't sure when she had started noticing Sharon's preferences, but she had. The way the girl quietly pushed the fish to the side of her plate at dinner, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she forced herself to eat a bite out of politeness. It had been subtle, but Deborah had seen it, and though she would never say it aloud, she found herself caring. Sharon's days became structured, filled with lessons and quiet study sessions under the guidance of her tutor. She devoured every subject with a hunger that even her tutor found remarkable, soaking up knowledge as if it were something precious that could be taken from her at any moment. Meanwhile, Samuel drifted further into his own world of privilege and rebellion. Unlike Sharon, school was an afterthought to him, a place he was required to be but had no interest in. He was the heir, the Weasley son, the one expected to inherit everything. What need did he have for test scores when his future had already been carved out for him? But his father saw it differently. One evening, as Sharon sat curled in the library, poring over a history book by the dim light of a desk lamp, the muffled sound of shattering glass echoed from down the hall. She stiffened. A beat of silence followed before voices rose, sharp and tense. Cautiously, she set the book aside and crept toward the doorway, peering into the corridor. The study door had been left slightly ajar, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows along the walls. Inside, Samuel stood near his father's desk, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his knuckles white from where he had slammed them against the wood. Shards of what had once been a paperweight lay scattered across the floor. Deborah was there too, her expression carefully composed, though there was something tired in the way her hands were clasped before her. "This isn't about her," she said evenly. Samuel let out a bitter laugh. Isn't it? She's everywhere. His voice cracked slightly at the end, a slip in his otherwise unwavering bravado. Deborah's expression softened. Samuel, your father loves you. Nothing has changed that. Samuel shook his head. Everything has changed. For the first time, Sharon saw something raw beneath his anger. A boy who had been raised to believe he was at the center of his father's world, only to find that center shifting. Deborah reached out, resting a gentle hand on his arm. You're his son. You always will be. Samuel looked at her, and for a moment he seemed almost lost. Then, as quickly as it had come, he swallowed whatever emotion had surfaced and took a step back. If you say so, he muttered, before pushing past her and out of the study, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared into the hall. Days later, the rift between them deepened. Sharon was leaving the study hall when she heard it. Raised voices from the hallway. She froze, pressing herself against the corner, unseen but listening. Samuel's voice was sharp, laced with frustration. You're failing your courses, Samuel. That was Ronald's voice, steady but firm. There was a pause before Samuel scoffed. So? What does it matter? It matters because I expect more from you, Ronald said. You expect more from me, but you don't expect anything from her, Samuel snapped. She's the perfect one, right? The one who studies all night, who listens to every little thing you say. His voice dripped with bitterness. You are my son, Ronald said, his patience thinning. Samuel let out a dry laugh. Yeah, but she's the one you're proud of. Silence. Then footsteps storming down the hall. Sharon remained where she was, her fingers gripping the edge of the wall. Something in Samuel's words settled deep within her, heavy and unfamiliar. That night, she read until her eyes ached, until the candle burned low, until the words blurred together. She would not waste this chance. She didn't know that Samuel, standing outside her doorway in the dim light of the corridor, had been watching her. And for the first time, he wasn't just angry. He was afraid. The cityscape stretched beyond the glass walls of Sharon's office, the evening light casting golden hues over the skyline. From this vantage point, she could see the world in motion, cars gliding through streets like veins pumping life into the metropolis, people hurrying across sidewalks with purpose, and buildings towering as monuments of ambition. It was a far cry from the Weasley estate, where silence reigned and the air was thick with expectations. She had built a life of her own. The past 25 years had not been kind nor easy, but Sharon had endured. She had learned, absorbed every lesson, every opportunity, and molded herself into the woman she was now, sharp, composed, untouchable. Her apartment was modern and sleek, filled with furniture she had chosen, devoid of the heavy, ornamental opulence of the mansion she once lived in. Here, every inch of space was hers, every choice her own. And yet, no matter how far she distanced herself, the Weasleys never quite left her. Her phone vibrated against the polished surface of her desk. The screen lit up. Ronald Weasley. Sharon exhaled slowly before answering. Yes? Are you free for dinner? His voice was steady, familiar in its quiet authority. She hesitated. It had been days since she last visited the estate, days since she had walked through those vast halls, since she had felt like an outsider in the only home she had ever known. But it was Ronald, and she owed him everything. I'll be there by 8, she said. Samuel, however, had remained unchanged in all the ways that mattered. The clock read past noon, and Ronald sat in his office, poring over business reports. The weight of expectation sat heavily upon his shoulders, though he never spoke of it. The Weasley family name carried more than just wealth. It carried legacy. He had always imagined Samuel as the one to uphold that legacy. But Samuel was nowhere to be found. The last he had heard, His son had been spotted in a private club downtown, laughing too loudly, drinking too much, spending money that wasn't earned. It wasn't unusual. This was Samuel's world now. Lavish parties, expensive indulgences, fleeting distractions. Ronald sighed, rubbing a hand over his temple. The Weasley estate had not changed. The chandeliers still glowed with an unwavering golden light. The scent of aged wood and expensive cologne still clung to the air, and Deborah still carried herself with the same effortless grace. Dinner passed with practiced ease. Deborah spoke about her garden. Ronald listened with quiet amusement, and Sharon answered politely when spoken to. Samuel was not there. It wasn't until afterward, as she was preparing to leave, that she heard the familiar cadence of Ronald's voice from his study. She hesitated in the dimly lit hallway, fingers brushing against the smooth banister, before stepping closer. The door was slightly ajar, enough for her to catch fragments of conversation. "The shareholders are getting restless," Ronald was saying. "They're impatient," came another voice, one she didn't recognize. "They expected Samuel to step into your role seamlessly." Ronald exhaled, the sound heavy with unspoken disappointment. "He isn't ready." Sharon's breath caught. She shouldn't be listening. She knew she shouldn't, but something kept her feet rooted to the floor. "Then perhaps someone else should be." Silence. Then, after a long pause, Ronald spoke again. "She's already built something of her own. I won't take that from her." Sharon's pulse quickened. Was he talking about her? A moment later, the conversation ended, and footsteps approached the door. She turned sharply, stepping back just as the door swung open. Ronald's gaze landed on her, unreadable in the dim light. "You heard?" It wasn't a question. Sharon squared her shoulders. "I wasn't trying to." He studied her for a moment before stepping aside, gesturing toward the open room. "Come in." She hesitated, then walked inside, the warmth of the fireplace casting long shadows across the walls. Ronald sat at his desk, folding his hands together. "How's the business?" Sharon blinked at the abrupt shift. "It's steady," she said carefully. "We're expanding into international markets." He nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "Good." Silence stretched between them. Then finally, he leaned back. "You were always a quick learner." She frowned slightly. "Ronald." He held up a hand. "I don't need you to take over the company, Sharon. That's not why I wanted to see you." His expression softened just slightly. "But I thought you should know the truth." Her fingers curled at her sides. "That you don't think Samuel can handle it?" His eyes darkened. "I love my son, but he—" Ronald exhaled. He was never interested in learning. Something in his tone made her chest tighten. "And I was?" she asked quietly. Ronald gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You always listened." The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Sharon had spent years listening, to conversations that weren't meant for her, to lessons Samuel had discarded, to the subtle, unspoken truths of this house. And somehow, without meaning to, she had learned. And Samuel had not. Sharon left the estate that night with a storm brewing inside her, thoughts circling in endless loops. She had spent years fighting to prove she belonged, to show that she was worth more than a charity case. And yet, even now, the divide between her and Samuel had only grown wider. She had built something from nothing. He had been given everything and squandered it. And Ronald knew it, and Samuel knew it too. Across the hall, he stumbled into the house, drunk at midnight. He had spent the evening drowning in indulgence, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place, the conversation that would change everything. He had always assumed that his place in the family, in the company, and in the world was his by default. But Sharon had just taken the first step toward proving him wrong. Autumn had arrived quietly, bringing with it the scent of damp leaves and the crisp bite of cooling air. The towering trees that lined the Weasley estate had begun their slow transformation. golden and red leaves drifting lazily to the ground, carpeting the pathways in warmth, even as the chill settled deeper into the bones of the house. But inside the estate, a different kind of cold had taken root. Ronald Weasley was dying. It had started subtly at first, a stiffness in his hands, a fatigue he could not shake. He brushed off Deborah's concerns, attributing it to age and stress. But then came the days he did not rise for breakfast, the moments where he forgot details he had once recalled with ease. The physicians were summoned, their expressions grave, their words wrapped in caution. A sickness with no cure. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and estates with quiet authority was now confined to a bed, his strong frame reduced to frailty, his sharp mind dulled by the inevitable march of time. Sharon visited him daily. She read to him from his favorite books, books about history, about great men who built empires, about legacies left behind. Sometimes he listened. Other times he stared past her, eyes fixed on some distant memory, his mind wandering to places she could not follow. Samuel did not come. At first, he made excuses, business meetings, pressing matters, appointments that never really existed. Then, he simply stopped mentioning them altogether. The absence became louder than words, the quiet neglect settling over the house like a suffocating mist. One evening, as Sharon sat beside Ronald's bed, reading in a low voice, he spoke suddenly, his voice raspier than it had been in days. "You're still here." She closed the book, looking at him. "Of course." He exhaled a slow breath, his chest barely rising. "You always listened." She swallowed. "And you always had something worth listening to." A faint smile ghosted his lips, but it was fleeting. His fingers twitched slightly against the blanket. "I thought I had more time." Sharon didn't answer. There was nothing to say. That night, the house was eerily still. Then, on a quiet autumn night, he was gone. The death of a titan does not come with thunder. It comes with the slow, resigned exhale of a breath never drawn again. It comes in the way the house stopped moving, the way the staff treaded lightly, the way Deborah, always composed, finally broke. Just once, a shuddering sob into Sharon's shoulder before she straightened and carried on. Samuel arrived 2 days later. He was not grief-stricken. His black suit was crisp, his eyes bloodshot, his expression unreadable. He spoke little, offered no comfort to his mother, barely acknowledged Sharon at all. It didn't matter. She had expected nothing. The funeral was a spectacle of power and legacy. It was held at the estate, a gathering of men in tailored suits and women adorned in somber elegance, all murmuring of Ronald's influence, his wealth, his place in history. Outside, the autumn air was thick with the scent of burning leaves and the distant hum of the city. Sharon stood slightly apart from the crowd, dressed in black, her hands steady, her grief quiet. She was not expected to weep openly, not expected to stand in the family line beside Deborah and Samuel, but she paid for the entire funeral without hesitation. She had not done it for recognition, nor gratitude, certainly not for Samuel's approval. She did it because Ronald had never made her feel like an outsider, because he had chosen her in ways that mattered. As the ceremony ended, Sharon caught fragments of whispered conversations drifting through the air. "It's strange, isn't it? The orphan girl paying for the funeral of the man who raised her. It's almost as if she was his real child. And Samuel, well, that one never turned out as expected, did he?" She ignored them. She did not need the world to define her place in the Weasley legacy. She had already earned it. That night, as the estate settled into silence, Sharon found Deborah sitting in Ronald's old study, her hands resting on the polished surface of his desk. She looked smaller somehow, thinner in her grief. "You should rest," Sharon said softly. Deborah lifted her gaze, and for the first time in years, she looked truly tired. "You did well today," she murmured. Sharon hesitated, then stepped forward, reaching for her hand. Deborah did not pull away. They sat together in the quiet, surrounded by the echoes of a man who had shaped both their lives. Somewhere down the hall, Samuel poured himself a drink. Sharon stayed with Deborah until the house finally fell asleep. Do you think Samuel can turn around? If so, comment pizza, and if you think otherwise, write tacos. The wind carried a sharp bite as Sharon stepped through the iron gates of the Weasley estate. Autumn had deepened since Ronald's passing, the once golden leaves now damp and brown, scattered across the stone pathway leading to the grand entrance. She had always thought of this house as vast and unyielding, but now, without Ronald's presence, it felt hollow. She had come to see Deborah. The older woman had been struggling, and Sharon made it a point to visit at least once a week, ensuring she was eating, resting, and breathing. But as she stepped inside, she was met with a presence she hadn't expected. Samuel. He was leaning against the stairway railing, a glass of dark liquor in hand, his sharp features set into something between amusement and disdain. He looked different, not grief-stricken, not lost, but bitter, in a way that settled deeply into his bones. "You still come here?" His voice was silk stretched over steel, casual yet laced with quiet resentment. Sharon ignored him, shrugging off her coat as she glanced toward the parlor doors. "I came to see Deborah." Samuel took a slow sip of his drink, his smirk never faltering. "Of course you did, still playing the devoted daughter." She turned to him then, calm but unflinching. "Someone has to." His grip tightened around his glass for just a fraction of a second before he scoffed, shaking his head. "You know, for all your success, for all your so-called independence, you're still here, still orbiting us, like you belong." Sharon exhaled, fighting the urge to roll her shoulders back. She had no desire to engage, but he wanted a reaction. "You built a company," Samuel continued, tilting his head as if in mock admiration. "What was it again? Fashion, clothing, something that disappears when trends change." He took another slow sip, eyes narrowing. "Meanwhile, I run an empire, our father's empire, the one you were so desperate to be part of." She watched him for a long moment, taking in the faint shadows under his eyes and the set of his jaw that was just a little too tense. Then she smiled. It was small, measured, the kind of smile that unsettles a man who is unsure of his footing. "You're right," she said smoothly. "I did build something, and unlike yours, mine isn't crumbling." Samuel's expression faltered for just a moment. Then he laughed, shaking his head. "You always did have a sharp tongue." He pushed off the railing and strode past her, pausing just long enough to murmur, "But this world doesn't reward ambition when you don't have power to back it up." Sharon didn't turn as he walked away. She only wondered how much longer he could keep pretending he wasn't drowning. Samuel took over Weasley Enterprises within weeks of their father's passing, and within months, it began to fall apart. Investments miscalculated, partnerships soured, clients walked away. The company that had once been synonymous with power and stability now stood on shaking ground, its stocks plummeting, its boardroom filled with whispered doubts. The empire that Ronald had spent a lifetime building was slowly unraveling, and Samuel, blinded by ego, refused to see it. The newspapers weren't kind. Weasley Enterprises faces financial crisis. Can the Weasley heir keep his father's legacy alive? A dynasty at risk. Deborah, once the silent pillar of the family, could only watch in helplessness. She saw it coming before Samuel did. She saw it in the way shareholders fidgeted in meetings, in the way trusted advisors spoke in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening. And worst of all, she saw it in Samuel himself. The desperation. The late nights were filled with expensive liquor and unread reports. The hollow confidence of a man who had inherited power, but not the wisdom to wield it. But he wouldn't listen. Not to her, not to anyone, and certainly not to Sharon. Sharon's company thrived. While Samuel was hemorrhaging money, she was expanding. What had started as a niche luxury brand had grown into an empire of its own, with investors lining up, eager to be part of her vision. The headlines were cruelly ironic. Weasley Industries crumbles as Sharon Vale's fashion empire soars. The Weasley legacy in jeopardy. Meanwhile, an orphan builds her own. She hadn't set out to overshadow them, but perhaps fate had a cruel sense of justice. She hadn't seen Deborah in over a month when she received a call from the estate. Deborah's voice was soft over the line, weary in a way that settled deep in Sharon's chest. "I need to see you," she said. That evening, as Sharon stepped through the grand entrance of the Weasley mansion, she was greeted not with hostility, but with silence. And then, a quiet confession. "The company is falling apart," Deborah whispered, the weight of the words pressing against the space between them. Sharon's stomach twisted, not in victory, not in satisfaction, but in something much more complicated. She had spent her entire life watching Samuel throw away what he had been given, and now the cost of his arrogance was becoming too great to ignore. The empire was crumbling, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she should let it fall. The rain had just begun when Sharon arrived at the Weasley estate. It wasn't heavy, just a steady drizzle that made the air damp and the roads slick, the kind of rain that whispered of endings rather than announced them with thunder. She stepped out of her car, pulling her coat tighter around her as she walked toward the grand entrance. The mansion still stood as it always had, an imposing monument of power and wealth, but something about it felt different now. Aged, weary, hollow. Deborah was waiting in the parlor, her posture straight, but her face drawn. She looked older than Sharon remembered, the weight of grief and worry settling into her features like fine cracks in porcelain. "The board is restless," Deborah said without preamble, her voice quiet but firm. "They're calling for action. The shareholders want stability and—" She hesitated, as if reluctant to speak the next words aloud. "They don't trust Samuel anymore." Sharon exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of her coat sleeve. She had expected this. "How bad is it?" she asked. Deborah's lips pressed together before she answered. "Very bad." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the faint ticking of the antique clock in the corner. Finally, Deborah spoke again, softer this time. "He won't listen to me." Of course he wouldn't. Samuel had spent his entire life ignoring warnings he didn't want to hear. Sharon nodded once. "I'll talk to him." She found Samuel in the hallway, leaning against the bar cart in the study, a glass of whiskey balanced between his fingers. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from exhaustion to irritation in an instant. "Ah," he drawled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Come to gloat." Sharon crossed her arms, unfazed. "No." He let out a slow breath, setting the glass down with a sharp clink. "Then what? Come to deliver some patronizing speech about how I should have listened to you? Or are you here to rub your success in my face?" She ignored the bait. "I'm here because the company is failing, and I can help." Samuel laughed, short and humorless. "Help?" He pushed off the bar, stepping closer. "You think you can just walk in here and fix everything? You're not family, Sharon. Stay out of this." The words hit like a slap, but Sharon didn't flinch. Instead, she held his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not doing this for you." Her voice was even and measured, but there was steel beneath it. "I'm doing it for him, our dad." For the first time, Samuel was silent. The rain pattered against the windows, the only sound between them. Then finally, he looked away. The boardroom was silent. The men and women seated around the polished mahogany table shifted uneasily in their seats, their expressions ranging from thinly veiled skepticism to outright impatience. The Weasley name, once a symbol of power and prestige, was now teetering on the edge of collapse, and everyone in the room knew it. At the head of the table, Samuel sat stiffly, fingers laced together, jaw tight. His suit was tailored to perfection, his posture straight, but his confidence was fractured. He was barely keeping the company together, and they all could see it. Then there was Sharon. She sat at the opposite end, poised, calm. If she felt the weight of their scrutiny, she didn't show it. The contrast between her and Samuel was striking. He looked like a man struggling to stay afloat, while she looked like she belonged. "Let's get one thing clear," Sharon began, her voice measured, cutting through the tension like a blade. "This company is not beyond saving, but the way things are going, it will be, unless we act now." One of the older board members, a man in his 60s with sharp blue eyes, leaned forward. "And what exactly do you propose, Ms. Vale?" She glanced at Samuel. His expression was unreadable, but he gave the smallest nod, a silent concession. She turned back to the room. "First, we restructure our leadership. Samuel and I will work together as co-executives." Murmurs rippled through the boardroom, to stabilize operations and regain investor confidence. One of the executives, a woman in her 50s with a sleek bob, raised an eyebrow. "And why should we trust you to do that?" Sharon smiled, cool and composed. "Because I've built a company from the ground up, and unlike this one, mine is thriving." The murmurs grew louder, and this time they carried a different tone. Consideration. Samuel straightened in his seat, pushing past whatever bitterness still lingered. "Weasley Enterprises has always stood for strength. That hasn't changed. But we need to adapt. Sharon understands modern markets, and we'd be foolish not to use that to our advantage." It was the first time he had ever spoken of her as an equal. A long pause followed, before the head of the board finally nodded. "Then let's see what you can do." The first weeks were hell. Samuel was set in his ways, accustomed to working alone, used to people bending to his authority. Sharon was sharp and relentless, refusing to entertain his ego, challenging his every outdated decision. Arguments were inevitable. "This is a luxury brand, not some trendy startup," Samuel snapped one evening, tossing a report onto the table. "And that mentality is exactly why you're losing clients," Sharon shot back. "You can't expect the world to stay the same just because it worked for you once." His jaw clenched. This company was built on tradition, and traditions don't mean anything if there's no company left to uphold them. Silence. The fire between them burned hot, but slowly, something shifted. Samuel started listening. Late nights in the office turned into late-night strategy meetings. Heated arguments turned into discussions. Sharon watched as Samuel began to change, shedding arrogance for practicality, recognizing the cracks in his leadership and learning how to fill them. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was trying. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying alone. Months passed, and the company stabilized. Investors returned, cautiously at first, then with confidence. Deals were renegotiated, outdated strategies were abandoned, and a new vision emerged, one that blended Ronald's legacy with Sharon's modern insight. The Weasley name, once whispered in doubt, was now spoken with respect again. Samuel sat in his office one morning, sunlight streaming through the massive windows. The room was quiet, save for the rustling of a newspaper in his hands. The headline caught his eye. "Weasley Industries rises again, thanks to an unlikely partnership." He exhaled, setting the paper down, staring at the words. They weren't about him. They were about them. For the first time, Samuel wasn't angry at the acknowledgement. He was proud. Proud of what they had built together, and for the first time in his life, he was proud of Sharon. 3 years had passed since Sharon and Samuel had stood in that boardroom, the weight of Weasley Industries pressing heavily on their shoulders. In that time, everything had changed. The company, once teetering on the edge of collapse, had found new life. Sharon and Samuel had built it together, not without struggle, not without conflict, but with a shared understanding that this legacy was worth saving. And now, on this warm summer afternoon, Sharon stood before a mirror, smoothing the delicate lace of her wedding dress, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Today wasn't about business. Today was about love. Michael had entered her life when she least expected it, a man so different from the world she had grown up in. Where others saw her as sharp and relentless, he saw her as strong, as kind, as someone worth standing beside. She had met him through work, through late meetings and negotiations, through quiet moments over coffee when neither of them had realized what was happening until it had. He had been there when she was exhausted, when the weight of the company threatened to drown her. He never asked for anything in return, he simply stood by her, and now he was waiting at the end of the aisle. The sun was warm that afternoon, casting soft golden light through the cathedral windows. The air smelled of fresh roses, their pale ivory petals arranged meticulously along the pews. A faint hum of whispers drifted through the space as guests settled into their seats, their conversations filled with anticipation. Sharon stood in the quiet of the bridal suite, fingers smoothing over the delicate lace of her gown. The fabric was soft and intricate, hand-sewn in her own atelier, a testament to everything she had built. She had spent years constructing her empire, ensuring every detail, every stitch was flawless. And today, in the culmination of it all, she realized this was the only dress she had ever truly designed for herself. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Deborah standing there, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You look beautiful," Deborah murmured, stepping forward. Sharon smiled. "Thank you." A moment of silence stretched between them, before Deborah reached for her hands. "I know I never said it enough," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I am so proud of you." Sharon felt her throat tighten. For years, she had never sought Deborah's approval. But hearing it now, in this moment, it mattered more than she could ever explain. She squeezed Deborah's hands. "You were always like a mother to me." A single tear slipped down Deborah's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, offering a small, trembling smile. "Come on," she said, clearing her throat. "Your escort is waiting." Samuel stood at the entrance of the chapel, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Sharon hadn't been sure he would agree. When she had asked him to walk her down the aisle, there had been a long silence, a hesitation that made her wonder if she had overstepped. But then he had exhaled, nodding once, almost reluctantly, and now here they were. Samuel shifted, glancing at her. "Are you sure you want me to do this?" She arched an eyebrow. "Backing out now?" He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Number just still. Not sure why you asked me." Sharon studied him for a moment before speaking. "Because you're my brother," she said simply. Samuel didn't respond right away. Instead, he offered her his arm. "Let's get this over with." She took it, and as they began their slow walk down the aisle, he leaned in slightly, his voice just low enough for her to hear. "Dad would be proud of you." Sharon felt something break open inside her. The music swelled, the guests rose to their feet, and at the end of the aisle, Michael waited, his eyes filled with nothing but love. Deborah watched from the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a delicate handkerchief. And for the first time in her life, Sharon felt like she truly belonged. The reception hall glowed under the soft golden light of chandeliers, the air thick with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the warmth of old friends and new beginnings. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long streaks of amber and violet across the sky. Sharon stood at the head of the room, a champagne flute in hand. The voices around her quieted as she stepped forward, the familiar weight of expectation settling in her chest. Not the suffocating pressure of proving herself, but something lighter, something earned. She scanned the room, the people who had shaped her, the ones she had fought for, the ones who had fought against her, and yet they were all here. Michael gave her a reassuring nod from across the table, his love steady, unwavering. Deborah sat beside him, elegant as always, but her eyes were soft, proud. And then there was Samuel, leaning back in his chair, watching her with something she could only describe as acceptance. She exhaled, lifting her glass slightly. "When I was 10 years old," she began, her voice carrying over the room, "I lost the only family I had ever known." A hush fell over the crowd. I remember standing alone at the funeral of a man who had worked his entire life as a gatekeeper for a home that was never his. My grandpa never had wealth, never had power, but he had kindness. And that was everything to me. She swallowed, her fingers tightening slightly around the glass. I thought that was the end of my story, that there would be no one else, no second chances. But life has a way of surprising you. Her gaze flickered toward Deborah, then Samuel. I was taken into a house that wasn't mine by people who didn't have to take me in. And for a long time, I didn't believe I would ever truly belong. I fought. I struggled. I built walls around myself, convinced that if I wasn't careful, I'd lose everything again. A pause. But I was wrong. She turned her gaze upward, as if speaking beyond the room. There are two men who are no longer with us today, but they shaped me in ways I will never forget. Her voice softened. Josh, who taught me what it meant to be loved, even in the simplest ways, and Ronald Weasley, who, despite everything, gave me the tools to build something for myself, to be more than just the girl he once pitied. A few scattered sniffles echoed through the hall. My foster mother, who carried a serious but silent love, was the first person in the family to remember what food I hated and what I liked. She never said she loved me, but her love never stopped. Deborah emotionally put her hand on her heart and looked at her when she said. Finally, Sharon let out a quiet breath, glancing at Samuel. And then, of course, there's my brother. Samuel stiffened slightly, clearly not expecting that. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. We spent years at odds, convinced that we were too different to ever be anything but rivals. But somewhere along the way, we stopped fighting against each other and started fighting for the same thing. Her lips twitched into the faintest smile, even if he still refuses to admit that I'm always right. Laughter spread through the guests, and even Samuel huffed, shaking his head in amusement rather than irritation. Sharon let the noise settle before continuing, her tone turning gentler, more reflective. I built a business from nothing. He rebuilt a legacy that was crumbling. And through all of it, we finally became something more than just two people sharing a name. She met his gaze. We became family. Samuel looked away briefly, lifting his glass slightly, a silent acknowledgement. Sharon turned back to the room, her heart lighter than it had ever been. Tonight is about love, not just the love between me and my husband. She glanced at Michael, who gave her a playful wink, but the love that comes from places you least expect. From people you never imagined would become your home. She raised her glass higher. To love. To family, those we are born into and those we find along the way. A chorus of voices echoed her toast, glasses clinking, warmth spilling through the room, like a quiet kind of magic. Later that evening, as the last of the guests filtered out, Sharon found herself standing with Deborah and Samuel beneath the dim glow of the reception hall's chandeliers. A photographer approached, lifting his camera. One last photo for the night. Sharon hesitated. For years, she had always felt like an outsider in every family picture. But this time was different. Deborah stepped to her side, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. Samuel, with only the slightest grumble, stood on her other side. The three of them, together. As the shutter clicked, Sharon smiled, because for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was standing on the outside looking in. She was home. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.